Hello everyone, and welcome to Orthodox Shahada. I'm Kai, and this presentation is part of a series examining Hadith methodology. In this video, we demonstrate that no substantial eyewitness testimony exists to conclusively establish what Muhammad did and said. The corpus of hadiths that Muslims rely on to know about Muhammad, and which they use to establish Islamic law, were all written down after Muhammad died. In other words, Muslims lack a robust manuscript tradition traceable to the lifetime of Muhammad to conclusively demonstrate what he did and said. Now, just a side note to briefly address what I'm expecting to be the knee-jerk reaction from Muslims, namely to start talking about how Muslims supposedly have biographies of the hadith narrators and therefore can establish with certainty a chain going back to Muhammad. We will discuss this specific point eventually in the series and demonstrate how argumentation relying on biographies of the narrators is fundamentally flawed and unreliable. Here in this video, we aim only to establish that there are no substantial eyewitness testimonies of Muhammad's actions and sayings, meaning that practically the entirety of the hadith corpus cannot be reliably corroborated historically so as to accurately reflect what Muhammad did and said. Consider what the scholar Imran Iqbal al-Badawi writes in his book, The Quran in the Aramaic Gospel Traditions. Quote, "While there are some non-Muslim sources dated to the latter half of the 7th century from nearby lands that mention the advent of a new Arabian prophet and the conquests of hordes coming from Arabia, there exists no narrative of the Prophet Muhammad and revelation of the Quran prior to the Sirah literature, written over 1 century after the fact." End quote. On this next slide, I have listed most of the source material that Sunni Muslims rely on for hadiths. Now, this isn't an exhaustive listing, as the purpose is not to indicate every obscure or lesser known and lesser consulted work. In any case, every single one of these books, which scholars and jurists rely on to establish what exactly constitutes Islam, are written down after Muhammad died, and in most cases significantly long after, and none belong to any of the Sahaba, or companions of Muhammad. In this slide, the plus sign indicates that the material cannot be from earlier than the indicated year, which typically designates the birth year of the author. The minus sign indicates that authorship cannot exceed the date indicated, i.e., corresponding to the author's year of death. Recall that Muhammad died in 632. The earliest source is not earlier than 660, and is the Sahifa of Hammam ibn Munabbih, who was of the Tabi'un generation, meaning that he was not an eyewitness to anything with regards to Muhammad. All the famous works come after that date. So for example, works by Abu Hanifa are not earlier than 699, the Muwatta of Malik no earlier than 711, Al-By Shafi'i no earlier than 767, the Musnad of Ahmad ibn Hanbal no earlier than 780, and then getting into the collections of Bukhari, Muslim, Abu Dawud, Tirmidhi, Ibn Majah, and Nasai, all in the 9th century. Muslims will claim that this later material simply incorporates earlier material that was extant at the time of Muhammad. But that's just a claim where the burden of proof is on Muslims to provide manuscript evidence. We as non-Muslims are under no obligation to accept the Muslim claim without evidence. The burden of proof is especially exacerbated for Muslims when their own scholars maintain that hadiths were indeed written down during the lifetime of Muhammad. From scholar Muhammad Hashim Kamali in his textbook of hadith studies, quote, "Some commentators have drawn the conclusion that prohibition of the writing of hadith was actually meant to prevent the writing of the Quran and the Sunnah indistinguishably on the same page or collection, but that writing was otherwise permitted if the two were clearly separated. There's also the opinion that the initial prohibition of writing the Sunnah was subsequently set aside and abrogated by the Prophet himself. Some support for this can be found in the practice of the companions who actually wrote hadith with the explicit permission of the Prophet. This opinion has, however, been disputed by those who noted that the prohibitive position concerning the writing of hadith was practiced and observed by the companions for quite a long time, and it may therefore be inaccurate to say that it was abrogated. The more likely interpretation that can combine these various positions might therefore be that the original prohibition was the general ruling of hadith, and the permission that the Prophet subsequently granted to some of his companions like Abu Shah and Abdullah bin al-As was specific and given for particular reasons. The proponents of the view that there was an abrogation of the original ruling have added that after the initial period, the Ummah as a whole and the ulama and the jurists have unanimously accepted basic permissibility of writing the Hadith. This is undoubtedly the position that has prevailed ever since and represents general consensus, or ijma', of the Ummah." End quote. In other words, Muslim scholars agree that Hadiths were written down during the lifetime of Muhammad. So it is not unreasonable to ask for manuscript evidence, especially since we're dealing with the 7th century. Now, the Muslim cope that we expect is that the writing down of the Hadiths is not absolutely necessary because the contents can be preserved as oral tradition, and so asking for manuscript evidence is not a deal breaker. But if Muslims want to emphasize the oral tradition route, then they are faced with a dilemma. If oral tradition among a random body of Muslims can be preserved, then it is unreasonable to deny oral preservation of the Christian faith by the Church. Why is it assumed that Muslims can preserve oral tradition while Christians cannot? Just as how Hadiths, i.e. oral tradition, are integral to Islam, the oral traditions preserved by the Church are integral to Christianity. The argument is basically that if Muslims want to invoke the oral tradition cope, then they have no ground to stand on to criticize Christians invoking oral tradition with regards to Christ's ministry, the apostles, and the early church. If Muslims want to deny oral tradition to Christians, then they have to deny oral tradition to themselves, which leaves them in a worse position because they do not have the textual manuscript evidence to substantiate their hadith claims insofar as eyewitness testimony is concerned. The bottom line is, if Muslims want to invoke oral tradition for themselves, then they must grant the same privilege to Christians. Now, we can demonstrate holes in the Muslim position. If the Hadith system is able to preserve Islam in its pristine state, then Muslims need to explain the Sunni-Shia divide, which occurred among the Sahaba, or companions of Muhammad. The Sunni and Shia differ not only politically and theologically, but also differ over core issues with regards to Islamic practices. For example, it was Umar, the second caliph for Sunnis, who changed the adhan, or call to prayer, a change which the Shia reject. From the Muwatta of Malik, quote, "Yahya related to me from Malik that he heard that the Muaddin came to Umar ibn al-Khattab to call him to the subh prayer and found him asleep. So he said, 'Prayer's better than sleep,' and Umar ordered him to put that in the adhan for subh." End quote. The phrase, "prayer's better than sleep," that Umar unilaterally commanded be added to the adhan after hearing some guy utter it, never existed during the lifetime of Muhammad. Without this hadith, Sunnis would be forced to claim that the phrase was always part of the adhan. This is an example in writing of actual corruption of Islamic practice, not only by a Sahabi, but someone who Sunnis unanimously regard as, quote-unquote, rightly guided. And the argument goes the other way as well, namely Shia corruption of the adhan by inserting references to Ali, who is the 4th caliph for Sunnis and the first imam after Muhammad for Shia. Again, something that never existed during the lifetime of Muhammad. Both Sunni and Shia may say that these corruptions are optional, meaning they can be left out, but such a response misses the overarching argument being made. Now, I want to be clear. The issue is not about the adhan per se. Rather, the point is to give an example how Islam has been corrupted using the adhan as an example, and how this poses serious problems for Muslims who want to critique Orthodox Christianity. To address the corruption in the adhan, Sunni Muslims have two possible copes, each leading to devastating results. The first option is to say that Umar had the right to change the adhan. If that's the case, and the adhan was divinely revealed, then that means Muslims are allowed to corrupt divine revelation. But if the adhan was not divinely revealed, then Islam can be corrupted based on personal discretion. This then poses a problem for Muslims critiquing the Christian position, namely, Muslims now need to demonstrate why Christ's apostles did not have similar rights and authority with respect to Christianity as Umar did with respect to Islam. The overarching issue at play here is that of normative authority. But now, if Umar did not have the right to change the adhan, then consider the facts that he is regarded by Sunnis as the second caliph, that he was quote-unquote rightly guided, that he corrupted the adhan, which then implies that he led the Muslim Ummah astray with his corruption. The question of Umar and the Adhan hinges, for Sunnis at least, on the Hadith in the Muwatta of Malik, and speaks to more general principles at play, namely 1. That Hadiths are fundamental to Islamic epistemology, and 2. The validity of Islamic practices hinges on knowing their sources. The overarching concerns with Hadith methodology that interests us are with regards to epistemology and normative authority. The overall thrust is to demonstrate that Muslims are not in a position to criticize Christians with regards to epistemology and normative authority. For those who are unfamiliar with the terminology, epistemology is meant to address the questions how we gain knowledge. How do we know something? In this case, how do Muslims obtain and verify knowledge absent of eyewitness testimony? By normative authority, we mean to address the question who establishes correctness. In this case, how do Muslims enforce what is correct? Who has the authority to impose what constitutes correctness? A classic example that touches on epistemology and normative authority is to be found in Imam Shafi'i. Consider what Bilal Phillips writes in his book, The Evolution of Fiqh. Quote, Imam Shafi'i combined the fiqh of Hijaz, Maliki thought, with that of Iraq, Hanafi thought, and created a new madhab which he dictated to his students in the form of a book called Al-Hujjah, the Evidence. This dictation took place in Iraq in the year 810 CE, and a number of his students memorized his book and narrated it to others. This book and period of his scholarship are usually referred to as Al-Madhab al-Qadim, the old school of thought, to differentiate it from the second period of his scholarship which occurred after he reached Egypt. In Egypt, he absorbed the fiqh of Imam al-Layth ibn Sa'd and dictated Al-Madhab al-Jadid, the new school of thought, to his students in the form of another book which he named the Essence. Because of his exposure to a completely new set of hadiths and legal reasoning, in Al-Madhab al-Jadid, he reversed many of the legal positions which he had held while in Iraq. Imam Shafi'i holds the distinction of being the first imam to systematize the fundamental principles of fiqh, which he recorded in his book called Ar-Risala. End quote. So in this example, almost 200 years after Muhammad died, you have clear evidence of how Islamic law can be manipulated due to its faulty epistemology and normative authority. It's not to say that Imam Shafi'i was manipulating Islamic law maliciously, but rather that Islamic law by its very nature, being principally reliant on hadiths, is susceptible to manipulation based on what is accessible. And these laws that are formulated as a result are binding on Muslims. Basically, it always amounts to speculation and guesswork, because Muslims cannot be certain that they have access to the entirety of hadiths. This is a fundamental epistemic problem that Muslims can never escape. This now brings us to ask Muslims the following question. Where are the eyewitness accounts in manuscript form of hadiths written down during the lifetime of Muhammad? Which leads us into making the following challenge to Muslims. Produce as many manuscripts as you can of hadiths written down during the lifetime of Muhammad. The question and challenge posed are reasonable given the Islamic claims, yet Muslims will find it quite difficult to respond adequately. Now, just a very important side note to reiterate what was mentioned at the beginning of this presentation. The issue here does not hinge on the biographies of the narrators. That is an altogether separate issue that will be addressed in a future video, God willing. Sunni Muslims harp on and on about how they know with certainty which hadiths convey information truthfully on account of knowing the biographies of the narrators, and on account of this, Islam is in a unique superior position compared to other religions, namely Christianity. The biographies pose a serious epistemic problem on their own to be discussed separately. For those who want a sneak peek, one problem, among many, is that the biographies suffer from an infinite regress problem with regards to authentication. The question is simple. If the biographies are used to authenticate the hadiths, then what is used to authenticate the biographies? And then what is used to authenticate the authentication of the biographies, and so on. Right now, at this point, we are simply looking at establishing that eyewitness testimonies do not exist. Basically, before we do the actual lobotomy, we need to first prep the patient. Despite not having eyewitness testimony, Muslims claim superiority in their epistemology. Consider what Imam Nawawi writes in his commentary to Sahih Muslim. Quote, "An aspect of his, Allah's, grace is the care taken of the sunnah of his beloved messenger, peace be upon him. God has favored the Muslim community, may he increase its honor, by the isnad discipline which is unique to it and unshared by any other community over any period of history. He assigned for the preservation of this honorable sunnah eminent critical scholars who ensure that it remains immune to distortion. They work in all countries and generations to distinguish the true from the false, and to prevent any addition to or omission from it. They thus ensure that the Muslim community will continue to have access to it throughout all generations until the end of time." End quote. Now that's a pretty strong claim that Imam Nawawi makes, basically claiming preservation without any evidence to support the claim. Consider what the scholar Muhammad Mustafa Azami writes in his book Studies in Hadith Methodology and Literature. Quote, "As far as Hadith literature is concerned, I have established in my doctoral thesis, Studies in Early Hadith Literature, that even in the 1st century of the Hijrah, many hundred booklets of Hadith were in circulation. If we add another 100 years, it would be difficult to enumerate the quantity of booklets and books which were in circulation. Even by the most conservative estimate, they were many thousands. Only a very small amount of this Hadith literature has survived. It could be said that either what I have described is totally wrong, or these books were in existence at some time but were lost later. This second hypothesis raises another problem, i.e., of the negligence of the Hadith of the Prophet by Muslim scholars. Is it possible that they did not feel any necessity of Hadith literature and so it was destroyed? As a matter of fact, my position is precise and correct. These books were not destroyed nor did they perish, but were absorbed into the work of later authors. When the encyclopedia-type books were produced, scholars did not feel the necessity to keep the early books or booklets, and so slowly they disappeared." End quote. So here is full admission that nothing by way of written hadiths from the lifetime of Muhammad survived. Azami's speculation as to what may have happened to the material is of no concern because that's all it is. Speculation. If anything, Azami's reasoning amounts to demonstrating that Muslims were actually careless to preserve their own history. Also consider what the scholar Muhammad Hashim Kamali writes in his book, A Textbook of Hadith Studies. Quote, "One of the best-known collection of hadith that was written during the Prophet's lifetime was As-Sahifa As-Sadiqa, the True Collection by Abdullah bin Amr bin al-As. It contained 1,000 ahadith, and although the actual manuscript has not reached us, its contents have been quoted almost entirely in the Musnad of Imam Ahmad bin Hanbal. This has often been described as one of the most reliable historical documents to prove the writing of hadith during the Prophet's lifetime." End quote. Again, we have admission that hadith manuscripts during the lifetime of Muhammad don't exist. But what is striking is the idea that the writing down in the 8th-9th century by Ahmad ibn Hanbal amounts to demonstration of a most reliable historical document. Without having an original manuscript, whatever Ahmad ibn Hanbal wrote down, it cannot be conclusively demonstrated to be an eyewitness account. So if Muslims are consistent, then they shouldn't have problems with Christians writing something down 150 years after Christ and claiming that to be a highly reliable historical document, right? Or are Muslims going to engage in some sort of special pleading that such is reliable for them, but not for anyone else? What we are dealing with is the cold hard fact that none of the hadith sources that Muslims rely on to establish truths about Muhammad's actions and sayings can be conclusively demonstrated to be eyewitness testimonies. Not a single one. The implication is that Muslims are not in a position to criticize Orthodox Christians with regards to epistemology, let alone normative authority, meaning the Church. So far, there are 2 entries in this video series looking at Muslim epistemology and normative authority. In the first episode, Main Reason Muslim is Inferior to Bukhari, we demonstrated that it is not necessary to establish that hadith narrators actually met. In this episode, No Eyewitness Testimony Exists, we demonstrated that no hadith manuscripts exist during the lifetime of Muhammad. Stay tuned for future episodes as we continue to examine Islamic epistemology and normative authority.